My phone rang at 20:13 a.m. It was my brother. I answered half asleep, expecting panic or tears. Instead, his voice was calm, almost pleased. Mom died last night. You get nothing? There was a pause, waiting for my breakdown. Waiting for me to beg. Waiting for pain. I smiled. "'Kay," I said softly, and hung up. He thought silence meant defeat. He didn't know silence was preparation. For years I had been the invisible one. The one who sent money when Mom was sick. The one who handled hospital bills quietly. The one who skipped holidays to work overtime while he visited once a year with flowers and apologies. He lived in comfort. I lived in responsibility, and Mom knew it. 3 days after her funeral, I visited the house. He stood in the doorway like a king who had won a war without lifting a sword. He said. I nodded, still smiling. I just came to pick up a few memories. He laughed. Memories don't pay rent. No, I replied. But truth does. Inside my bag was something he never thought about: copies, bank transfers, medical receipts, legal documents, messages from Mom, her handwritten notes. The one that mattered most said, "If anything happens to me suddenly, check the safe deposit box. Everything is explained there." He never checked. He was too busy celebrating. 3 months passed. In those 3 months, I became invisible again. But this time it was strategic. I met with a lawyer, then another, then a financial auditor, then a journalist who specialized in inheritance fraud and elder financial abuse. You see, Mom had changed her will, but my brother had hidden it. What he inherited was not everything. It was only what he rushed to claim. The real inheritance was protected, and documented, and traceable to me. The article came out on a Tuesday morning. Local man under investigation for concealing final will and misusing end-of-life assets. By Thursday, his bank accounts were frozen. By Friday, his company suspended him pending investigation. By Saturday, his friends stopped answering his calls. And by Sunday night, my phone rang again at 20:13 a.m. This time his voice shook. They're saying I committed fraud. They're saying I stole from Mom. You knew about this, didn't you? I let the silence stretch. The same silence he once used to hurt me. You said I got nothing, I replied calmly. So I took nothing and turned it into everything. 2 weeks later, he stood outside my apartment, thinner, desperate, no pride left, just fear. Police, he whispered. They're going to take the house, the accounts, my reputation. Help me. I'll give you half, more than half. Just make it stop. I looked at him and felt something I never expected. Not anger, not triumph, just clarity. You already gave me what I needed, I said. You showed me who you were. He fell to his knees. I'm begging you. I knelt too, so we were eye level. When Mom was sick, I begged you to visit. When she cried for you, I begged you to call. When I needed help paying her bills, I begged you to share the weight. You said you were too busy. I stood up. Now you know what it feels like. I walked inside and closed the door. Not because I hated him, but because revenge isn't about destruction. It's about letting people face the consequences of who they chose to be. The phone call came in the quietest part of the night, when the world feels fragile and every sound carries weight. I recognized my brother's number immediately, and for a brief moment I thought something terrible had happened that would finally bring us together in shared grief. When I answered, I was prepared for tears, for panic, for the kind of broken voice that asks for support. Instead, his tone was steady, almost proud, as if he were announcing a promotion rather than a death. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't pause to let the news settle. He simply said, "Mom died last night. I inherited everything. You get nothing." The words didn't come with sympathy. They came like a verdict, like a victory speech. It was clear he had rehearsed them, imagined this moment, waited for the chance to say them out loud. He wasn't just informing me, he was asserting power. He wanted to hear me shatter. He wanted proof that he had finally surpassed me, that all my years of sacrifice meant nothing compared to his single stroke of luck. I felt the air leave my lungs, not from grief alone, but from the cruelty of the delivery. My mother had just died, and somehow this had already become a competition. In his mind, her life had ended, and his reward had begun. I could almost see him standing taller as he spoke, enjoying the idea that I had been erased from her legacy. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask if I wanted to say goodbye. To him, the story was finished, and I was the loser written out of it. For a second, pain rushed through me like fire. Memories of late nights in hospitals, unpaid bills, silent sacrifices, and unreturned calls flashed through my mind. Every moment I had chosen responsibility over comfort, love over convenience, Loyalty over recognition suddenly felt mocked by his words. He had taken the final chapter of our mother's life and turned it into a trophy. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of breaking, I felt calm. Not peace but clarity. The kind that arrives when you realize exactly who someone is. His sentence wasn't just an announcement. It was a confession. It revealed his character more clearly than any argument ever could. He had shown me that this was never about family. It was always about winning. So I smiled. Not because it didn't hurt, but because I understood something he didn't. He believed inheritance was about property and money. I knew it was about truth and time. And time, unlike wealth, always reveals what was hidden. Okay, I said quietly and ended the call. After that night, I didn't cry the way he expected. I didn't call back to argue, and I didn't rush to demand answers. Instead, I let the silence sit between us like a wall he couldn't see through. He thought my quiet meant surrender, that I had accepted defeat and was too ashamed to fight. What he didn't understand was that my calm wasn't weakness. It was focus. Pain had sharpened my thinking instead of breaking it, and I knew that reacting emotionally would only give him the satisfaction he wanted. I began to collect myself the way one gathers scattered pieces after a storm. Every memory, every document, every message that had once felt ordinary suddenly became important. I searched through old files, emails, and boxes I had kept without knowing why. Receipts from hospital payments. Records of transfers I had made for Mom's treatment. Texts where she thanked me and apologized for burdening me. Notes where she mentioned how proud she was of my responsibility. These weren't just memories anymore. They were proof of devotion, of presence, of truth. I didn't confront him. I didn't warn him. I let him continue believing he had won. While he walked around the house like a king in an empty castle, I was quietly building a foundation. Each piece of evidence was a brick. Each appointment I scheduled was another step forward. I met with professionals who knew how to read between legal lines, who understood how greed often leaves fingerprints behind. They didn't rush me. They taught me patience, and patience became my strongest weapon. At night, when the world was quiet, doubt tried to creep in. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to demand fairness, to remind him of everything I had done. But I reminded myself that shouting would only make noise. Preparation creates results. Revenge that is rushed is messy. Justice that is planned is precise. I watched from a distance as he spent freely, confident that nothing could touch him. He celebrated an inheritance he hadn't fully understood. He assumed documents could be ignored, and truth could be buried. That arrogance was exactly what I needed. It gave me time. It gave me space, and most importantly, it gave me control. In those months I changed. I stopped seeing myself as the overlooked sibling and started seeing myself as the architect of my own outcome. Silence became my shield. Strategy became my voice. While he thought the story had ended, I was only writing the beginning of mine. The truth didn't come crashing in like thunder. It revealed itself slowly, piece by piece, like a puzzle finally making sense. The more I searched, the more I realized how carefully Mom had planned everything. She had never trusted chaos, and she would never have left her final wishes to chance. In her last months, she had grown quieter, more observant, as if she were preparing for something none of us wanted to accept. I remembered how she once held my hand and said, "Sometimes people show their love loudly. Sometimes they show it by protecting you after they're gone." At the time, I thought she was just being emotional. Now, I understood. I found a note hidden inside an old book she loved. The paper was slightly yellowed, her handwriting shaky but firm. It mentioned a safe deposit box and the importance of checking it if anything seemed wrong or rushed. My heart pounded as I read it. This wasn't suspicion. This was foresight. She had anticipated conflict. She had anticipated greed. And she had prepared for it. At the bank, everything changed. The documents inside the box were neatly organized, sealed, and officially stamped. There was a newer version of her will, signed and witnessed, leaving the majority of her estate in a trust that named me as the primary beneficiary. It also explained why. In her own words, she wrote about gratitude, reliability, and presence. She wrote about who had stood beside her when illness stripped her of dignity and strength. She wrote about who had shown love not through promises, but through action. And there it was, undeniable proof that my brother had known. The dates didn't lie. The will had been changed months before her death. He had rushed to claim the older version, hiding the truth so he could appear victorious. What he called inheritance was actually theft wrapped in confidence. I felt no excitement, no rush of triumph, only a steady, powerful sense of grounding. The narrative had shifted. I was no longer the forgotten sibling. I was the one carrying her true legacy. What he tried to bury was now the very thing that would expose him. These documents were more than legal protection. They were her final voice. Her way of saying that love is seen, even when it isn't praised. That sacrifice is recorded, even when it isn't rewarded immediately. She had trusted me with responsibility in life, and now she trusted me with truth after death. What my brother had taken was temporary. What she had given me was permanent. When the legal process finally began, it moved faster than I expected, not because the system was cruel, but because the evidence was undeniable. Truth has a strange gravity. Once released, it pulls everything into alignment. The lawyers filed the documents, and within days the illusion my brother had built started to crack. Notices arrived from banks, from property offices, from institutions that had once welcomed him with respect. Accounts were frozen. Transfers were suspended. Assets were placed under review. The same confidence he had worn like armor began to dissolve into panic. He called me then, not with arrogance, but with confusion. He said there must be a mistake. He said paperwork gets mixed up all the time. He said he was sure everything would be cleared soon. I listened quietly, because I knew what was coming. Fraud is loud once it's exposed. It doesn't stay hidden, it echoes. Soon his name appeared where he never expected it to be, in legal records, in professional inquiries, in whispers among people who once admired him. Reputation, I learned, is more fragile than wealth. Money can be regained. Trust, once broken publicly, becomes a shadow that follows you everywhere. The company he worked for suspended him pending investigation, unwilling to risk association with dishonesty. Friends grew distant, not because they knew all the details, but because doubt is contagious. What hurt him most wasn't the loss of luxury. It was the loss of certainty. He no longer walked like someone who owned the future. He moved like someone unsure of the ground beneath his feet. The house he bragged about felt less like a trophy and more like evidence. The accounts he celebrated became symbols of what he might lose. Everything he had claimed so proudly was now under a microscope. I didn't celebrate. I didn't boast. I didn't even speak much. Justice doesn't need an audience. It needs patience. I watched as the world responded not to my anger, but to documented truth. That was the real power. I didn't have to destroy him. His own actions were doing that work. Each legal letter was not revenge, it was correction. Each frozen account was not cruelty, it was consequence. He had built his victory on a mission, and now a mission was being punished. The system he thought he could outsmart was simply restoring balance. For the first time, he understood something I had always known, that power taken dishonestly never lasts. It rots from the inside. His confidence had been loud, but it had been hollow. Mine was quiet, but it was rooted in truth. And in that silence, while his world grew smaller and more unstable, mine grew calm. Not because I had won, but because justice had finally arrived. When he finally came back, he didn't look like the man who had called me that night, with pride in his voice. His shoulders were slumped, his clothes hung loosely on him, and his eyes carried a fear I had never seen before. The confidence that once defined him had been stripped away, replaced by desperation. He stood outside my door as if he no longer belonged to the world he had tried so hard to dominate. The brother who once declared victory now looked like someone begging for survival. His voice broke as soon as he spoke. He said everything was falling apart. The house was at risk, the accounts were locked, and his name had become a burden instead of a badge of honor. People who once praised him avoided his calls. Opportunities vanished without explanation. He admitted he couldn't sleep, couldn't think, couldn't escape the feeling that he was being crushed by consequences he never believed would come. For the first time, he wasn't talking to control the situation. He was talking because he had lost it. He tried bargaining first. He offered money, property, anything he still believed he had power over. When that failed, his tone shifted. He spoke of family, of shared blood, of forgiveness. He reminded me of childhood memories, as if nostalgia could rewrite betrayal. His words were no longer sharp. They were fragile. Each sentence carried the weight of regret, though I couldn't tell if he regretted what he had done or simply that he had been caught. Then he begged. Not dramatically, not loudly, but with a quiet humiliation that cut deeper than anger ever could. He said he would do anything to fix it. He said he finally understood how alone he was. He said he had been wrong. Hearing those words didn't bring me satisfaction. It brought clarity. This was the moment he had denied me for years, the moment of acknowledgement, but it came only after everything had collapsed. I realized then that loss teaches faster than love. While Mom had tried to guide him with patience, life was now teaching him with consequence. He was facing the truth not because he wanted to grow, but because he had nowhere left to hide. His power was gone, and without it, he didn't know who he was. I listened without interrupting. But because I was moved, but because silence was now my strength. The roles had reversed. I was no longer the one asking to be seen. He was. And in that moment, I understood that true revenge isn't watching someone fall. It's watching them finally understand why they fell. I didn't feel the rush of victory people talk about when someone who hurt them finally stands broken in front of them. What I felt was something quieter and heavier, like the closing of a long, exhausting chapter. As I looked at him, begging and desperate, I understood that revenge had already completed its work without me needing to add cruelty to it. His punishment was not coming from my hands. It was coming from his own choices. And that made all the difference. For years, I had imagined that justice would look dramatic, that it would feel powerful and satisfying. But standing there, I realized justice doesn't roar. It settles. It brings a strange kind of calm because it restores balance instead of creating more damage. I wasn't interested in humiliating him the way he had humiliated me. I wasn't interested in proving I was stronger. Life had already done that in a way far more honest than I ever could. I told him I wouldn't save him. Not because I hated him, but because saving him would erase the lesson he needed to learn. If I stepped in now, I would be protecting him from growth, from accountability, from facing who he had chosen to become. And I refused to carry his weight again, the way I had carried everyone else's for so long. That chapter of my life was over. I saw then that revenge is misunderstood. It isn't about destruction. It isn't about watching someone suffer. That kind of revenge only traps you in the same darkness that hurt you. Real revenge is freedom. It is refusing to be defined by betrayal. It is choosing dignity when you have every excuse to choose bitterness. I didn't forgive him in words. Forgiveness is personal, and it takes time. But I released him from control over my emotions. That was more powerful than any punishment I could give. His mistakes were no longer my burden. His regret was no longer my responsibility. I allowed him to own what he had done without interference. As he walked away, I didn't feel loss. I felt space. Space to live without resentment. Space to rebuild without fear. Space to finally honor my mother not through conflict, but through integrity. She had trusted me with truth, and I chose to carry it without hatred. I learned that strength is not proving someone wrong. Strength is proving you no longer need their validation. Strength is walking forward without dragging the past behind you. He had taken money, time, and trust, but he could no longer take my peace. That was the real ending. Not his collapse, my freedom.